Dear colleagues, friends and brothers and sisters, good morning. Welcome back to the second day of our conference on Christianity and the Chinese society. The focus of this morning section will be on the interaction between Christianity and the Chinese society. The first paper will be presented by Professor Frederick Feldman, and followed by the response by Professor Xu Jian. Professor Frederick Feldman is an associate professor of Theology and senior lecturer in Chinese at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Feldman's research is mainly focused on religion in contemporary China, especially Christianity, but he also takes an interest in religious policy and propaganda language. Feldman has also studied Xinjiang and Wales, as well as the history and the presence of Sino-Western cultural exchange. From 2012 to 2013, Feldman was a senior research fellow at City University of Hong Kong. And from 2007 to 2011, he's a researcher at the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters, History, and Antiquities. Since 2008, Feldman is a board member of the Institute of Sino-Christian Studies in Hong Kong. So let us welcome Frederick Feldman. Yeah. And now I pass the floor to Professor, and you have 30 to 45 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and I also thank the organizers for arranging this conference and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to visit, and yesterday was very fruitful, and I hope we will have a good discussion also today. So, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, I will talk today about what I call interaction through adaptation with a question mark. And adaptation, of course, is related to the Chinese government, the party state request for adaptation, as I will mention later on. But it's also a fitting word, I think, to relate to how Christianity has been interacting with Chinese society. Of course, we didn't mention this yesterday, but we didn't say anything about what is China and Chinese. No one said anything yesterday, so I will just start by saying this, because we all assume this is the majority Han culture, which is about 90% of the current PRC population. But that means there are over 100 million other people living in China. They're also Chinese citizens. Yeah. And many of them are Christians, actually. And not a word was said yesterday. And I won't do it either. Not in my speech, but let us just have this in mind. So what is Chinese in this sense? It's many things, actually. I look at history, it's the same thing. You have this Xianbei and Xiongnu and other cultures also establishing Chinese dynasties. Liao dynasty, it's Chinese, it's Khitan, but anyway. Let's go on to the present time. No? Okay. Yeah, I can start anyway. I will try to analyze through three different perspectives. A socio-political perspective, dealing with Christianity in regard to the political entity of Chinese society. And then also a cultural intellectual perspective, and then a practical missional perspective, the actual dealings of local churches with. Thank you. So these three perspectives of interaction between Christianity and contemporary society: socio-political, cultural, intellectual, and practical, missional. But the focal point of all this is adaptation. Not only the imposed adaptation, but the actual adaptation, reactions, and how Christianity, and of course the other religions as well, how they react and interact with it. It's a matter of adaptation. Has been all the time from the beginning, actually, I would say, in the Tang Dynasty. So the socio-political perspectives. just to recapitulate a bit about Chinese current PRC religious policy. Since the 1950s, the Communist Party has been promoting what they call the 5 characteristics of religion. Mass character, ethnic character, international character, complex character, and long-term character. And these are interesting. And this is nothing new. It's from the 1950s. But they are interesting in a sense that when you start talking about adaptation from the government in the 1990s, these 5 become quite conflicting. Of course, mass character, there are a lot of Christians, a lot of religious people in China. That's quite obvious. But then ethnic character, it's already problematic because Christianity does not have an ethnic character in China. Because there are mostly Han Christians, but also other ethnicities. While Muslims are characterized as 10 ethnic groups are Muslims. But it doesn't apply to Christianity. So that's not really. Then international, it's also conflicting with the ethnic character, because international meaning it doesn't come from China, it's international. Every religion except Taoism is international in a sense. Complex, of course, it's complex, 复杂. It's difficult to deal with. And I think this is important also. The government party recognizes this complexity. And then the long-term character, meaning that it will exist as long as the Communist Party, perhaps. It will just wither away with the arrival of socialism, which might not come. We don't know. But all through this, and as a result in the modern times, after Mao Zedong, in the early 1990s, the party and the government started promoting what they call an adaptation of religion to socialist society. And the Chinese phrase is slightly different. There's a 宗教社会主义社会相适应. And the xiang, this third character from the end of the characters, it does have an idea of reciprocity. Should the socialism or society adapt to religion? Well, you might think so, but if you study carefully religious cadre material, it specifically says that no, this is not the case. It's only one side. So the xiang is only there for the surface, which is, I find interesting. Why keep it if it doesn't have a meaning? But it probably sounds better. But we will see that it's not as simple as that anyway. Jiang Zemin, who was the one who started promoting this adaptation policy in 1993 and then again in 2001, his speech has been summarized into 4 sentences. The first one is, of course, the one about adaptation. The second one is implementation of freedom of religious belief, not freedom of religion. This is important to remember also in the Chinese setting. Religious belief, 宗教信仰自由. Because freedom of religion would mean also freedom to arrange your religious meetings, but that's not the case. You can believe what you want, but having religious activity is something else. Then strengthen leadership of religious work. Religious work is party state rhetoric and discourse on religion, basically, how it's implemented. And then insisting on the principle of independence, meaning independence from foreign influence, mainly. The core of this adaptation idea from the party state, the government, is to promote patriotism, to reduce tension between believers and non-believers, to play down religious teachings that are not in harmony with development, and also, again, promoting the best traditions of religion. This is interesting. I'm currently writing a paper on the expression best traditions. I'm not finished yet, but next conference perhaps. But this best traditions of religion, it does again repeat patriotism, harmony, social service, and independence. The same thing again. And I found that the patriotism element of best traditions especially interesting. How can one religion in China be patriotic and not maybe in another country? It's the same religion. This is, of course, also very... Professor Vermander was speaking about the ambiguity of these phrases yesterday, and I think this is both ambiguous and very clear, thus making it even more ambiguous in that sense. But this is a fascinating topic. The best traditions, what are they? This is a very long quote. I will not read all of it. It's just an example of the language of certain party leaders. This is Jia Qinglin, who is retired now. He was the head of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference previously. And he had a long speech about religion in 2006. And he stresses harmony as important content, serving development should be made the important task, 重要任务, going all out to exert oneself for development. And there's nothing about anything ethical, religious. It's all about serving development. And this is, of course, the core of adaptation. To reduce, as I see it, reducing the religious content. We will see more examples of that, but this is one way of expressing it. Harmony, serving development, and again serving development. You find a number of these speeches, but this is, I found, particularly illustrative. So how is the actual response? As my experience is primarily with the Protestant church in China, I will make an example from the China Christian Council and the Three Self Movement. And in 1998, they had their first official response to this adaptation policy, and they started talking about and promoting building up theological thinking. They would themselves translate it as reconstructing theological thinking, but the 建设, the end of this Chinese expression, it could mean reconstruct, but this, as I see, there's nothing to reconstruct. Because before 1949 was a different situation, and after 1949, they didn't have time yet to develop something of their own. So how can they reconstruct? They can construct something, build something. And this is, of course, it's a good slogan. It's workable. You can work with this. The main core of this is to adhere to promote faith that accords with the Bible. It's a strong stress of correct view of the Bible, actually. So what is a correct view of the Bible? We can discuss this for a whole conference. You should pay attention to individual spiritual development. Well, this is a good point. Don't deviate. Don't become a heretic. And you promote Christian ethics. Again, ethics, moral, not faith, not the specific religious content. And there's a lot of talk in this program to play down certain teachings to avoid conflict with other beliefs and with non-believers. But the word used is interesting. Play down is in Chinese is 淡化. You can choose 5 other words with the same meaning, but they've chosen 淡化. And it means actually originally desalinate. And in a Christian context, to use a word meaning desalinate, at least for me, I immediately think about different Bible verses with salt losing its saltiness. Sermon of the Mount and other places. How could you not think about this? And what does it mean when Christian faith loses its saltiness? It is a disaster. It's not adaptation in a positive way at all. It's the contrary. So this choice of words was not very, I wouldn't approve of it really. So is moralized religion the goal? To reduce the faith content? It may seem so. And even Liu Xiaofeng, who I will come back to shortly, a well-known cultural Christian, already in the 1980s, he wrote in one of his most famous books, morality is not religion. It's not the leap that faith demands. Alluding to Kierkegaard, of course, leap to faith. So this aspect of reducing religious content, I think, is a core thing in this setting. Through my work and my visits in China and relations with local Christians, I haven't done a formal field study of this, but my personal observations from the last 20 years is that, of course, the Three Self Movement, the local Christian councils, they follow this policy. They do implement, they talk about building up theology. They follow the requests. They use the same slogans. They use the same wordings. They do have meetings. They have conferences. But what I find when I talk to people, I even participate on the side of these kind of events, they do adapt again. It's an adaptation of the adaptation. Because they use this framework, but they put different content in it. They might have before lunch, they have a meeting with the Religious Affairs Bureau, and they have these official talks, 顺其思想建设, 什么什么什么. But then in the afternoon or the next day, there are only church people there, no officials. And then they talk about useful things, useful for the local churches. And it's a true theological discussion. They present papers with a different content than the first day, perhaps. So that's, of course, adapting. They can live with this framework. And it's not harmful, but it's not useful, but it's there. And they use it this does happen, actually. I have several experiences of that. So they adapt the adaptation, which is, of course, quite natural, I would say, and pragmatic in a very Chinese way. Then, in recent years, as Professor Vermander was mentioning yesterday, the 中国化, the Sinicization has been coming. But also, the theological thinking with Chinese characteristics, 中国特色神学思想, which is, of course, something new, but the 中国特色, the characteristics is old, Chinese socialism with socialism with Chinese characteristics. But the tone is different, I would say. The leader of the State Administration of Religious Affairs, Wang Zuo'an, in his speech when they celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Three Self Movement in 2014, he said these are inevitable demands on the path of adaptation. 必然要求. This is much stronger than the just 要求 or the request. This is inevitable. You have to do this. There's no other way. Which is, I would say, it's a turn towards a stricter implementation. Then you can discuss for a long time what is 特色神学思想. It's a bit difficult to focus on this. But the 必然要求, the inevitable demand, is quite strong, I would say. And then again, 2015, even more interesting comment by Zhu Weiqun, a previous director of the United Front Work Department of the Communist Party. He talked about reducing the burden of religious activity on the believers. Again, it brings up biblical images in my mind. Come to me with your burdens, and I will ease your burdens, and so on. But how can the Communist Party and the government of China reduce the burden of religious believers? By reducing religious activity, and then giving another burden of social activity, which is basically what he's saying. So which burden is easier? And again, it is a way of making religion less religious and more of a moral teaching or something social. And this is an interesting comment. So, next perspective, cultural intellectual. You might have heard about the cultural Christian phenomenon in the 1980s and 1990s. This is, of course, not relevant as a phenomenon anymore, but the persons involved are still around, they're still important, and they have left a legacy of reintroducing Christianity and other religious studies into academia in China. A very strong legacy, and also influenced a lot of younger scholars. And I would say this is one of the most important adaptations of Christian faith in contemporary Chinese society. It was quite unexpected to see that how could a Chinese scholar choose to study theology? Liu Xiaofeng, that I mentioned here, he studied in Basel in Switzerland and got his PhD in theology with Heinrich Ott as his Doktorvater. And he was one of the very early PRC scholars of any kind, no church affiliation, to study theology on the doctoral level in the 1980s already. And he wrote, of course, several books that I mentioned here that are, I would say, scholarly bestsellers. They've been re-edited, reprinted, and sold in numbers that are unimaginable for a scholarly book, in thousands of copies. Fascinating. This is my PhD thesis topic, actually, Liu Xiaofeng. So I have to mention him, of course. He has turned away from Christian studies nowadays to something quite different, so you don't talk about that, but it's a topic of its own. He's more into nationalist political philosophy, I would say, today. So he's turned away, but his impact is still very strong, and he's still around. He's teaching at the Renmin University, a colleague of Professor Yang. And he wanted to establish at that time, in the 80s, a new modernity, you could say, a new Chinese social setting with the Christian faith and Christian ethics as the foundation for a new kind of society. And this is, of course, also sort of totally reversed adaptation. I know no Confucianism, no communism. This is different, but also very Chinese. What they do is a typical Chinese intellectual response to crisis. So I step forward and I say, this is my solution. Listen to me. I'm an intellectual. I should do this, to speak to the emperor or to the Communist Party. They wouldn't listen to Liu Xiaofeng, I think, but still, it's a kind of response in that sense. That is a kind of adaptation. Of course, many other names. Zhuo Xinping, it might be familiar for many of you. He Guanghu. These quotes here are not recent. They are from the 1980s, 1990s. Zhuo Xinping is a Communist Party member and a standing committee member of the National People's Congress, that is a Chinese parliament. So he's a high-ranking politician and one of China's leading religious scholars, an expert on Christian theology, studying in Germany in the 1980s. And he even talked about if Chinese Christians could implement their powerful spiritual strength in Chinese society for the development, which is, of course, very much in line with the current Communist Party line, but in a more positive way and with a true scholarship behind it. He Guanghu has a different response. He talks about the better future for China. A key is political reform, but the foundation is spiritual improvement. And in his view, Christian spiritual improvement, I would say. But both of them are very Chinese in this. This is a Chinese intellectual response. He Guanghu talks about this threefold crisis of faith, 三信危机, which is a government expression, actually. It's been used for the lack of social cohesion, lack of trust between people in society, and so on. But he uses it and analyzes it also with religious content, which is also, I find it's an interesting idea that to use this kind of public debate, accepted concept within the frame of religion and Christianity. So these are, of course, if you're not familiar with Zhou Xinping and He Guanghu, these are interesting names to look into. I wouldn't say they are cultural Christians. I mean, there are no cultural Christians. We should say this about the term cultural Christian. Many have been called that, and I use the term myself, but of course, it's an ambiguous and difficult term, borrowed from Richard Niebuhr, originally through Bishop Ding Guangxun, and most people called that, wouldn't accept the term. But for reasons of there's no other name, let's call them that. But they don't really exist anymore, I would say. There is a group of younger intellectuals that have been influenced by these cultural Christians, and they are turning to Reformed theology. I've called them New Calvinists, Reformed Puritans. Alexander Chow in Edinburgh, he's debating with me, saying, "Oh, they are public theologians." He even has a book just coming out with this theme. But what they do, the cultural Christians were individualists. They weren't baptized, most of them. They didn't go to church. They took a stance not to accept dogmas and so on, but they wanted a private, direct relation to God. But these groups, they focus on a rather strict kind of Calvinist Reformed congregation where the church discipline is important, complementarian views, women have their roles, men have their roles, very strict on that. Women can't be pastors. I mean, China is full of women pastors in the Protestant church. It's very, very common nowadays. But these groups of younger generation people, with young people who grew up in a commercially liberal society of 1990s to 2000s, and then they turn to a strict Calvinism, which is interesting. And they talk about constitutional democracy, religious freedom, Puritan ethics. And I see it as they try to create a new Geneva, quotation marks, in China. This is attractive. I mean, Geneva, in the sense of mostly Max Weber, there's a lot of term confusion here. They talk about Calvin and Beza and Zwingli, but Max Weber is always at the back of their minds. That's what they read first, I think. And, Protestantism, capitalism, democracy, this is the solution. And I find this very fascinating phenomenon. Yu Jie, Bateson are famous names. Yu Jie has left China. He lives in the US nowadays. He's a critic and scholar, writer. Bateson is a bestseller author, one of China's most well-known authors, actually. He's selling hundreds of thousands of copies of his books. He writes TV dramas, whatever. And they were both members of the same congregation some years ago in Beijing. And they proposed to evangelize culture, and not through a Calvinist perspective, but a Christian cultural perspective to change China. Christians in China need to write more literature, to write music like Johann Sebastian Bach, or very lofty ambitions. We should have a Christian culture in China transforming society. Of course, this is unrealistic, but it's visionary. And it's a very different kind of adaptation, if you say so. But what do you do? Is this the rational choice? What choice do you have? I'm an intellectual with Christian faith. What can I do? And I choose this path, and it might work. And it has been working very unexpectedly, and they attract a lot of people. I mentioned Sunni because he's more a scholarly person. He's a professor at Renmin University, and he's one of those who really go into the theological aspect of this phenomenon. And he's also a leader of the Shouwang Church. It's a very famous unregistered Reformed church in Beijing who is struggling with licenses for meetings and so on. So the practical missionary perspective, this is a third frame. What happens in congregations? How are they affected by the situation in China, and how do they adapt? This regulation, normal religious activity, it's one of my favorite phrases of Chinese political language. What is normal? Have you been to a normal mass recently, or a normal service? Have you thought about this? Of course, on one side, it's normal. I mean, you follow the procedures, it's normal. But when does it go out of hand? Who decides? This is the thing you live with. And then you adapt. From the Cultural Revolution, people learn to work in small groups, and now they're categorizing them more carefully: women, youth, elderly, men, professionals, etc., etc. Church planting, you split off in small groups. This is, of course, Protestant examples. I wouldn't dare to say about Catholic Church, but so they have transformed their methods. There's not large-style public meetings, but then also there is a lingering effect of something Western. This straightforwardness. It might be a faction of Chinese mentality or something. This is a minefield to talk about what is Chinese in this sense. But 你为什么不信教呢? Why don't you believe in Jesus? This kind of, I heard this many times. I would never go out to a stranger in Sweden and say, oh, why don't you believe in Jesus? I think people would just run away. But it happens in China. So they do this one-to-one evangelization style, and they have these small groups. This is a formation, adaptation to reality in Chinese society. So this is the very practical missionary approach. And of course, the idea of mission orientation, spreading the gospel, 传福音, this is important. This is definitely informed by Western influence in China, I would say. Impulses from Western undercover missionaries in China, definitely. The phrasing and the wording, but it takes a Chinese form. It adapts again. And the last point here on this list, the social belonging aspect, which I find specifically interesting, and something that the church itself might not always see that clearly. Why do people come to church? Is it because of this straightforwardness? Is it because people talk about Jesus openly? Well, certainly, but maybe not always. After the Cultural Revolution, social networks were destroyed. Anyway, if there were local networks, clans, villages before the Cultural Revolution, and it broke down, but maybe they formed new ones in the collectives, maybe, at the best. But then in the 80s, there was nothing like this. Even the Danwei system is breaking down on the work units. So where is your social belonging? Where is your, what is certain in your life? There's a lot of uncertainty for many people. So religious groups and Christian, this involves faith healing, I would say. You search for help of some kind. You go to this place, you go to a Taoist, you go to someone else, you go to a hospital you can't pay for. You go to the Christians because they offer you at least concern. They might pray for you, you might get some help. They might pray you might not get healed, but you still feel better. And this is because you have a strong belief? Not necessarily. I have a friend who is a Buddhist in Beijing. He grew up as a very ardent communist youth league member, but now he's a profound Buddhist, and his mother has become a Christian, and he was so happy when he told me this. I don't know his mother. I know this person for 20 years, so I believe what he tells me. But from his description, I can feel this is only partially because of a very strong religious conviction of Christianity. She felt at home in the congregation. She had new friends. And this social belonging aspect, is the church aware of this sort of adaptation in that sense? Do they see this? I think locally, yes. On the national level, I'm not so sure. This is not academically founded. This is my experience telling me this. But this is an interesting factor that we should look into as academics as well, if possible. It's difficult to do a field study on this aspect, I would say. But this social belonging aspect is really important. And the thing that, of course, it's not specifically Chinese, but it takes quite different forms in Western society, where you have other social networks intact, or where people live alone, actually, and they have a very small circle of friends, at least in Northern Europe. So this aspect is not unimportant in the transformational adaptation and the interaction of Christianity with Chinese society. Yes, some final, bit more provocative questions. We talk about, and I've been talking about adaptation of Christianity as a response to the interaction and the need for interaction with Chinese society. But is it really Chinese? Back to my very first comments on what is Chinese. Of course, it's, as I said, it's very unexpected that you would have new Calvinists in China today. Who would know? But the cultural Christians are also, how could you predict that? But, and again, if you look back in history in other parts of the world, you will find similar events happening. There will be other revivals or focuses on a specific teaching, Calvinism, for example, in other parts of the world due to social or other circumstances. So when you look at the Chinese society, what can we benefit of looking at other societies, other traditions, where there might be similar phenomena so that we can learn from and while analyzing the Chinese setting? Is it just Chinese, or is it Chinese, or what is it actually? What kind of adaptation, what kind of formation is taking place? And then again, when we talk about this adaptation of Chinese society, and our idea as, now I talk as a white Western Christian Protestant, when we look at China, and we see increasing number of Christians in China, of all kinds, Catholics, Protestant, even Orthodox. But what would happen if China became Christian? Let's imagine a China with 35% Christians, like in South Korea, for example. What would it look like? Would we in the West, or we as Westernized Christians, would we think this is a good thing? Or would they adapt to transform into something else that we wouldn't accept? We don't know this. So why do we speculate about that? We talked about numbers yesterday. This is a very interesting study topic. But what would it mean? What would a Christian China be like? And of course, as Professor Vermander was saying, Sinicization is happening. It has been happening for a long time. And it's not the way that government would say it's Sinicization. We need to be aware of this. It's going a continuous process, all the way since the Tang Dynasty, perhaps. And then rationality. This is something I've been thinking about recently a lot. Are the Chinese more rational? This is a serious question. If you talk about Confucianism as a rational way of life, as a non-religious life ethic, it's a kind of rational choice. There's nothing spiritual, or you should respect the spirits. They are there somewhere, but it's not a part of your daily life. You have the rituals and the different categories you should interact with. But is that why the Chinese are rational in their choice of religion? The intellectuals, okay, I choose Christian Calvinism because this is the rational choice for me, wanting to promote democracy in China. Is that a factor? Or even the old ladies going to church for belonging. Is it a rational choice? I can't find it in Buddhism, I can't find it in Taoism. Okay, I go to the Christian church. There I find something. This is, of course, a bit provocative, but I'll end on this note. Are the Chinese more rational than the Westerners? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive paper by Professor Feldman. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much for the comprehensive paper by Professor Feldman on the contemporary interaction between Christianity and the Chinese society. It seems that he's arguing that the interaction is one way instead of a mutual one. That is, Christianity is adapting herself from different perspectives, from a social political perspective, from a cultural intellectual perspective, and a practical and mission perspective. And is it the whole picture of what's going on in contemporary Chinese society? So I would like to invite Professor Xu Jian to give his response. Professor Xu Jian is the professor of a School of Foreign Languages and Cultures and Institute of International Relations Studies in Sichuan University of China. He is also director of Center for European Studies of Sichuan University, vice president of Chinese European Studies Association, vice president of Chinese Senior Professors Association, a member of Teaching Advisory Committee of Foreign Languages and Literature under the Ministry of Education in China. His research areas include cultural studies, European culture, European ideology studies, EU and European integration studies. And his major publications are Searching Europe, the Core of European Integration, Dictionary of Biblical Literature and Culture, a reader of Western Cultural Studies, European Integration, Cultural Polemics and Implications, Understanding EU, Cultural Perspectives, and The Observer and the Observed. So, Professor Xu Jian, please.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. And also, thanks to Professor Fan. And this response is prepared together with my colleague, Professor Zhang Chongfu. He's also here with us this morning. And for the adaptation and synthesization on the contemporary Chinese Christianity, and for the you see, the question here, as a quick reflection on Professor Foreman's writing and presentation just now, in interaction through adaptation on Christianity in contemporary Chinese society. And for this topic is quite different from our discussion yesterday. And yesterday, I still remember, you see, on the last section, we saw Professor Laman and Professor Li. And one, you see, debating is about Yang Jiao. And for, you see, Professor Foreman's focus is on the contemporary China. And with Chinese forms, Chinese faces, Chinese practitioners. And then for, of course, foreign content and of Christianity. And this is a kind of a way to observe exactly. I quite agree with Professor Foreman's approach from socio-political perspective. That is a political, at the political level, the government and the party state, as Professor Foreman mentioned there. And that is what is the voice, political voice from the government. And also, second major focus in his observation is cultural, intellectual perspectives. And this is a kind of advocators and also promoters in China and for Christianity and combining with the modernization of China. And also for the third observation, practical missional perspectives, that is from the ordinary people, the church goers, and their purpose, and the real meaning and significance to them. And also quite thought-provoking with Professor Foreman's questions raised up there. And with this kind of questions, quickly, I would like to go back to what we discussed yesterday about, you see, the foreign missionaries and their adaptation to the Chinese context and Chinese culture. And this picture is, you see, classic building at the campus of my university, the clock tower at the medical campus, Sichuan University. And this clock tower was designed and built by United Church, Canadian missionaries at Sichuan University. And for the designing idea for the building, is, if you look closely, it's a kind of combination of Western church and also Chinese way, you see, architecture together. So this building built 100 years ago at the campus, it's a kind of symbol, or a kind of way we see the adaptation and for the missionaries in China. And also here for the points, I think we have to clarify the four terminology terms. One is adaptation and indigenization and contextualization and synicitation. And if we could clarify these four terms, might be that would give us some, you see, ideas to approach to some of the questions, whether we could, you see, find a way or find some, you see, significance and meaning. And this is a painting by Chen Xu, a Chinese painter, and painted this kind of religious content and with Chinese interpretation, Chinese way. And also follow this kind of a path for adaptation. And when China moving away from Marxist idea that religion is opium that poisons the masses. And the adaptation theory has been put forward by the CCP's own theorists in 1980s. That is, the Chinese scholars started to approach to the ideas. And then for the ideas that government and religion could work together, create a new united front. And religion has its social functions, and religious people can serve the country and add the government in the construction of socialism. And this is a kind of a political call from the government. And for this kind of a call, in what kind of a way we could approach and interpret the ideas there. And then for indigenization, the term indigenization is an expression widely used in Christian missions, and where it refers to making the gospel understood in the language and the thought, the forms of the local people, and to have their effort to make the church autonomous in its organization. And this is the idea and how to borrow that kind of idea in our understanding and approach to the contemporary Chinese scholars and cultural perspective in approach to Christianity. And this is a painting also by a Chinese, very famous Chinese painter, Lu Hongyan. And it's also a kind of a way we see the Chinese custom and the Chinese, you see, environment. And of course with the Western ideas. And so for this kind of a way, if we argue the contextualization, as a theology dictionary definition for contextualization, that is as a dynamic process of the church's reflection in obedience to Christ and his mission in the world. And on the interaction of the text as the word of God and the context as a specific human situation. And then in China, what we notice is, since you see the 1970s, missionary leaders have begun to use the term contextualization to move beyond the concept of indigenization. And then here, for Sinicization, this is a much questioned and debated word or terminology in China and also among the Chinese scholars. Professor Zhang Zhigang and Zhou Xinping and Tang Xiaofeng, the intellectuals and advocates of the concept of Sinicization of Christianity in China, and they have various arguments and ideas and publications. And since year 2012, Sinicization has become a very popular concept in China for debating, and which has led to a continuous research and discussion in the academic, religious circles and the government departments as well. And for how far this could be going and what you see really could happen in this kind of Sinicization, exactly as Professor Foreman, you see, argued there, not so, you see, unpredictable. You see, for the real sense and how to promote and how to, you see, carry on the mission of Christianity in such a kind of Chinese environment. And the Sinicization, what are the Chinese government worried about? The Chinese church was and would be controlled by foreign forces, or a dominant religion would destroy the religious ecology of contemporary China. And there would be a large number of cults in the form of Christian belief. And if you follow the political way, and exactly as Professor Foreman cited from, you see, different political head at the top level in China. And then Sinicization, what are the Chinese Christian community worried about? Opponents regarding Sinicization would cause Christianity to lose faith and bow to secular idols, or a serious threat to the purity of Christian faith. And this would definitely kind of a serious debating over there and for such kind of a background. And this is another painting by Lu Hongyan, and with Chinese background and costumes and setting, but Western content. And all these kind of paintings and the happiness, like yesterday we discussed about the missionaries and the Western missionaries in China and the process. So for this kind of a problem, although Christianity has been in China for over 1,000 years, it has not been well integrated into the Chinese context, and culturally and socially. And especially as yesterday Professor Yang argued about and compared with, you see, Christianity with Buddhism in China. And because of its foreign religious identity, and both the Chinese government and the public are worried that it is being manipulated by foreign powers to threaten China's national security, and that is at the political stance and within the government, and this kind of voice still quite strong there. So Sinicization of Christianity would be a very necessary way Or if we say, yes, that's the way, or it's a question, put a question mark. And then this is a kind of interesting idea. And then from there, going back to this Chang nationality in a small, you see, group of the minority between the Tibetan and Han. This kind of a tower, and then this group of people identified by the Western missionaries. And they noticed that at Denpa, this group of people used to be identified as Tibetan, but they're not. And they are not Han. So for this kind of for the foreign missionaries, their adaptation in Chinese contextual, and together not just with the religious knowledge and mission, and also with this kind of anthropological, historical, and in different way in the approach, as yesterday Professor Laman and Professor Lee, you see, discuss about the Western medicine in China. And also for panda. Panda was first, this kind of animal, strange animal, is now the symbol of a strand also of China for friendship. And it was first found in 1908 by a missionary family at a countryside market, farmer's market. A farmer, you see, was selling this animal, strange animal. And then the missionary bought it and then brought home for his kids. Eventually, they put it on boat and took it back to America. Unfortunately, it only survived for 3 months. But that was the first time for people to, you see, got to know this kind of animal exists. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, around by missionary family, anyway. And then coming back to the Western medicine and the medical part there. So for the question is that, you see, how to approach to be or not to be Christian. What we look at, you see, the missionaries, you see, and then the mission, Christianity mission in Chinese history. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of, if we look at it positively, that it's a mission, the mission is a process, and the mission is a progress. And then a question is that, you see, how we approach to this kind of a mission, and even to put this kind of a mission now in the completely Chinese form, Chinese faces, Chinese practitioners. And for this kind of mission, when we approach it, and then if you approach it through sociological way, the interpretation is different. If you approach it to theological way, and then the interpretation could be completely different. So thank you. This would be the kind of points I would like to reflect. Thank you.
Thank you for the dialogical response by Professor Xu Jian. While Professor Feldman is arguing the interaction between Christianity and the Chinese society through adaptation, Professor Xu Jian is showing the other perspective. It means by synesthesia. Are the two ways, parallel without any meeting points, or they can meet each other somewhere in on some common ground between them. So I open the forum to the public. Questions and comments and are welcome. Yeah. Yes.
Firstly, there is a test case already, a historical test case, and that is the adaptation or contextualization of Christianity in Europe, because Christianity is not a European religion. It is Easter now. Go to Egypt, go to the Holy Land around Easter, to Syria, once Lebanon, and you will see that it is quite different. The social imperatives around Christian communities is different, and the symbolism that comes with it. And of course, we're here in Rome. It was when Christianity developed. It developed in the far-flung corners of the Roman Empire, and then gradually came in and became mainstream. But this is the first historical test case. And then if you take China, for that there are some lessons that you can learn.
Yes, my question is for Professor Feynman. Frederick, I think you're quite Western-minded. Typical Western. Yes, you are. And so yesterday when you were commenting about Professor Lu's survey, and you questioned about his way of asking those questions, your concern is about this religious faith, religion, these kind of concepts. But I think, as a Chinese, I think his questions are much better. Because the Chinese, actually, they pervade this vagueness. This vagueness, or maybe it's just ambiguity, is in our blood. We think that way, and we prefer that way. So same thing, and when you talk about this 相适应 adaptation, you think it's one way. But for me, I think it's both. How can you say that China has not been adapted to the way the Christianity develops? You think that actually our understanding about Christianity or about religion is changing from the OBM to the other. It's always, and maybe now it's more strict, not like the 2008 or something, the golden age. But it's adaptating, it's both way. I still think so. And a lot of things, and like when you want to, now we have the law about religious issues, it is also adaptation. It is because, yes, somebody think that is, a strong control over the church issues or the religious issues, but on the other hand, actually it is the government promise that we're going to finish this application within certain days. If they are not, you can sue the officials, at least governmental level. It is like this. And also when you talk about Danhua, the reconstruction of Chinese theology, see these terms, yes, 建设 or reconstruction, and you think it's the reconstruction of what? Of theology of before 1949? But actually I think for Bishop Ting, it is reconstruction of the, recover or rediscover the Christian faith, or back to the core. Because at that time, it is the focus, at that time, the Danhua is too much on the one single faith doctrine. That's the justification by faith. So that's the reason that, and also Danhua, it is always the translation of the English that caused the problem. Because you use this, you try to interpret it, and then you cause and make things worse. A lot of outside comments, I think, add to that. And also so as Professor Shi talked about the thing is that, in those 18th, 19th centuries, when actually the missionaries were in China, they tried to adapt to the Chinese society and they built all the churches in the Chinese style. But later, after 1980s, when the church got much space to develop, and they're back to the cathedrals, the very, very traditional way. Actually, it is not only Christianity like this. the Muslims also, the Islamic, the mosque also back to that conservative. So it is a kind of global or universal element. And also, and then think of that, and then you talk about this new Calvinist. And they are more and more like a cult, or they're so care about these boundaries, and they are not like that much inclusive as Bishop Ting's generation, And still, at that time, that generation, they are still able to dialogue or have conversations with wider communities and being sensitive to the Chinese plural context. It is true that if Christianity, evangelized that way and very impulsory, it's not going to do any good in Chinese context, at least. So my main thing is that it's, you may talk about Xiang Shiying, you are biased there.
Thank you very much, Zhang Jing. Yes, I'm a male, white, Westerner, right-handed. I have an income that makes me among the 0.05% richest people in the world. I live in Sweden. It's a welfare society. Of course, I'm super privileged. And I choose sonology as my field of study, my work. And I lived several years in China. I speak reasonably good Chinese, I think. I try to understand the Chinese side. But of course, this is just a paper. And I choose this perspective because, I want to be a little bit provocative. I want to have a clear adaptation. You can choose, I choose this adaptation word because it's used by the government. And it fits the kind of setting. So, sure, I'm a Westerner. Fine. 老外啊, 洋人啊. No, but I don't want to be a friend of the Chinese people. That means something else. I'm a friend of Chinese people, but not the Chinese people, because that's a government thing. That's different. If you know what I mean. So, other questions? Very good questions. Yeah, of course, adaptation is both ways. Definitely. My point was that the government perspective is not both ways. That is perfectly clear. I read several books. 同章干部什么读本 several points saying 相是赢的相不是相 it's not a two-sided adaptation. It says clearly. You can buy the books in the bookstore in Beijing. I don't have an issue with that. Of course, that's quite obvious. I grew up in Sweden. It used to be a state church country until the year 2000 when it split up. The government appointed bishops. The Lutheran bishops of Sweden were appointed by the Swedish government. But that, of course, is a remnant of the kingly role, the royal prerogative of divine nature. We still have a king, but he lost his power 50 years ago, or more than that, 100 years ago. But the government had this function. But it has nothing to do with actual religious life. And now it's split up, now we modernize totally. But of course, I understand this perspective of the government controlling religion. I grew up with this. But it can be done in different ways, to say it mildly. And of course, and then you have all this whole perspective of the Chinese rule of law, rule by law, and how you implement the religious affairs regulations and so on. Of course, that is a lot of things to think about there. Adaptation. Danhua, yes. It's a difficult word, but Danhua, it does mean desalinization. And of course, I know you know Bishop Ting very well. You used to work with him. I know that. And so, of course, I don't know how he thought and his generation, what they thought when they promoted this. I've read the papers, but what they discussed, what they thought, I don't know. We don't know. We have to read the papers. That's what we can do. Because he passed away. So, and generations, there are only Chen Zimin is still alive, right? Yes, so he's 100 years old. He's maybe the last one of that generation that was involved in this. Well, the church is in Chinese style. It comes back to my very first question. What is Chinese? Today, China is a multi ethnic, commercialized, very modernized in the eastern part society. So what is Chinese? It's not the pandas. It's not the Huaxi Tower in Chuanda. I don't know what it is. It might be Calvinist intellectuals. Or no, but I just take them as I'm not a Calvinist intellectual in China. This is just an example of a kind of resistance through something reformed, which is a way of adapting to the circumstances. I would say maybe it's a rational choice. What can I do from my perspective? I want to achieve this, and I choose this form. And of course, I am a Christian. I have this faith, and I can live this out through this context. I don't take a stance in that sense. But yeah, it's difficult. We need to discuss it more.
Okay, just a quick response to Professor Lamon's observation there. I think it's quite right. If we talk about the Christianity, we have to observe, you see, in the Christianity's history, like in the like in the 5th century and the 16th century. And here are some other examples for something you see foreign and really got adapted in China, of course not religious. For example, for McDonald's. McDonald's had its most beneficial single restaurant in Chengdu. And Chengdu is, you see, quite popular as the, you see, kingdom for Chinese cuisine. And for McDonald's adaptation is that, you see, they serve Chinese porridge and youtiao for the breakfast. And then change that. And also Starbucks coffee. In Chengdu city, it's one of the, you see, single city most densely populated with Starbucks coffee. 260 Starbucks coffee. And for Starbucks coffee in Chengdu, they adapted the idea of a tea house in Chengdu. It's a kind of leisure, relaxing, people go and the communication there. But the environment is not green tea, but coffee. And also they provide the most powerful internet. And still culturally, the content still, you see, keep the American way. But for the locally, it adopted to that kind of, you see, tea house idea provided there. So for anything that is if we look at it as a kind of a process and a progress, that is a vitalization is sometimes we have to think about. Globalization, when we talk about that, we could not shun away from localization. So that's the new word, globalization. And for the word, you see, bar, borrowed into Chinese in 1995 as a kind of Western term, a place people go and hang out there, meet friends. And when bar got into Chinese way, in Chinese dictionary, now if you put into bar and you notice, we have shu ba, the place you go do reading. Wang ba, you go for internet. And the shui ba, you go for, you see, bottle of water. So once this word got into Chinese dictionary, and then you notice, you see, it got merged into the culture. Once it merged into culture, and then it's a kind of vital. And this is the kind of way sometimes we look at this kind of a situation that is adaptation and the contextualization with the original context. Probably this is a kind of a way, if we look at it, observe it through sociological way or cultural way, and maybe this is another way to look at that. Yes.
Professor Yang.
Thank you. I just want to continue the questions put up by my colleague, Kathy. Yeah, I know that Frederick Foreman is a very good scholar in the study of sinology. But just in this case, I suggest that you should be more careful when you use given terms in reference with Chinese terms. For instance, adaptation. You seem to be quite sure that adaptation is used in Chinese just in one way, but actually, theoretically or linguistically, it is impossible because you yourself related this term together with reciprocity. Do you know, James Black just used reciprocity to translate the very important word by Confucius in the Analects, that is shu. Shu, zhong shu, and shu. So shu is normally translated as many other ways, forgiveness, whatever, tolerance, but that is the translation by James Black. I think it is a very good verb, reciprocity. That tells us the nature of adaptation. And on the other hand, I think adaptation to the socialist society, the religious adaptation to actually, basically, I think a socialist society means modern society in Chinese, at least in accordance with my personal understanding. Yeah. And on the other hand, I think sometimes we should, as a scholar, we should try our best to offer positive explanation or interpretation, even though some terms might be used in a negative way. We should try to add some positive interpretation. For instance, sinicization. Personally, to be honest, I do not think it is a good translation. I think this translation is not only ideological, but also something maybe potentially could be found some bad intentions. Just as you must know that in the West, sometimes they translate the 国学 into national studies or national learning, but it is not. My university established the first school of 国学 in modern China. But from the very beginning, in English, we use the school of Chinese classics. It's nothing to do with national learning. And another master, Qian Mu, you must know that it's also a very important philosophy. The first sentence in his book of the introduction of 国学, the first sentence is that academia cannot be classified nationally. There's no national boundary for academic things. Yeah. So I think so. It is another way. Yeah. Another thing I would like to say, Martin Marty, a quite famous scholar in the United States, used to say, Christianity comes to us in many forms. I would say it's a joke. Christianity came to China even earlier than Christianity came to Sweden. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Yang Huilin. Of course, yeah, Christianity came to Sweden in the 9th century, 200 years later than into China. But so, sure, and thank you for the point. Of course, yes, you could use a positive. My basic point with being a little bit provocative is to also to point out that you can interpret these things differently. As you say, 国学, I totally agree with you. Of course, it's not national studies. That would be preposterous to say this is national. But as the terms are used in contemporary Chinese, at least political setting, there is a sort of, I would say, inclination to interpret it negatively because of the whole system setting, which is what I try to that's my point basically in using. I mean, of course, 宽恕, forgiveness, basically, in a Christian sense. So of course, 恕 but it can't be used in this context, because this 相适应 is the prescribed formula for this kind of adaptation policy. And if you look in these documents that I looked through, they specifically say it isn't reciprocal. It's nothing to do with that. But of course, it doesn't have to be negative anyway. I mean, if the policy is implemented in a positive way, it can work. And I see it work. That's one of my points as well. The adaptation, the second adaptation, people live with it. They don't stop worshipping. They continue to preach. It still works. But maybe despite instead of because of adaptation. So of course, yeah, it's a good point. Western Christians came to China before Sweden, so yeah.
Just add one thing in Chinese. James Lack, the reason why James Lack use reciprocity. 我说中文啊。我说因为Frederick Foreman 的中文非常好，所以我要跟他说一中文。
哪里
？James Lack 之所以用 reciprocity， 正是因为他看了朱熹的 commentary， to the Analect， 而那个 reciprocity 恰好真的是一个 mutually adaptation， 推己及人等等这个意思。
当然，朱熹和原始的儒家思想是区别很大。
所以我是说这个 linguistically it is impossible to use such a negative interpretation of adaptation.
Of course, yeah, sure. Thank you. 多谢杨教授。
Yes.
Just a follow-up to Professor Yang's comment. It's also about your interpretation of the phrase 相适应, adaptation. I think you are right that in this context, the adaptation is one-sided. But I don't agree with your interpretation of the meaning of 相, the character 相 in this context. Because 相 can mean reciprocity, as you mentioned, both-sided. But it can also mean one-sided, just to show the object of a verb. For instance, we say 相信. In that case, 相 just means the object of belief. So I think in modern Chinese, in this context, the original meaning of 相信 just one-sided. So, yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah. But maybe actually the reciprocal meaning of 相 is contemporary, but in classical Chinese it would mean something different, perhaps.
Yeah, I think both meanings can be found in ancient Chinese as well. I think, yeah, it can mean reciprocal and also the direction of a verb or the object of a verb.
But you have 互相, for example.
互相, of course, yeah. That's because of 互. Yeah. Or we have 两厢情愿. That's double-sided. That's because of 两. Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, the lady over there in red.
My name is Zhao Shasha. I'm a student here. I study history of the church. My question is to Professor Feynman. You said that we can't imagine what would a Christian China looks like. It reminds me about our two neighbors. One is Korea, one is Japan. I just searched that in Japan there are only 1% Christians, but in Korea there are more than 40%. And if we, despite the political issues, we can't actually, but just imagine. Despite the political issues, we just concerned about the cultural issues because we have similar culture in East Asia, in Japan, in China, in Korea. And what do you think we can be more like Korean? We have more Christians, or we just like Japan?
Oh dear. Wow, this is very unscholarly, very speculative. But an interesting question. I raised it myself. I realize. I'm sorry for that. Well, already there are several percent of the population in China are some kind of Christians. I mean, 4 or 5%, something like that. Numbers, Professor Lu can say more about the numbers he did yesterday. But if you look at Korea, up to 40% Christians now, what is the impact on Korea? Do we think of Korea as a Christian country? Not really. Most people know that there are many Christians, but it's also known for these enormous churches with tens of thousands of members, and a very special kind of church life and preaching style and so on that we don't really see anywhere else. Maybe in the US. I mean, there are a few large churches in China with many thousand members, but they are quite exceptional. My point of asking this question as a final question was that to turn our minds a bit, what are we Westerners, our expectations? Would we think, do we have this idea of what China would be like if it becomes a Christian country? I think we shouldn't think like this. Because if it does become a more Christian country, it's wonderful. As a Christian, I think it's wonderful. As a scholar, I think, this is very interesting. I can do research about this. But what if we can't know what it would mean. Because if you see, I scratched the surface in my paper here about different expressions. I mean, some Protestant expressions of faith, some intellectuals, but I mean, these Calvinists, there are very few. Counting numbers, there are a handful of congregations that are a few hundred people each. I mean, there are a few thousand people. But they have, because they are elite intellectuals, they have some impact. So, yes, that could happen, that elites do impact. But as long as there is the Communist Party rule in China, it's difficult to see how there would be a great impact from the Christian, even if it grows much bigger. I mean, I suppose the Communist Party would have to change its policies if it would grow much more. But in what way, it's very difficult to say. Personally, I'm quite open-minded that I mean, the way of the gospel and the Christian message can take root anywhere. This is speaking from a Christian perspective. This is, of course, it's a universal message, theologically speaking, and it doesn't see the boundaries of cultural language and states and so on. That is one perspective. But then, of course, there are cultural differences and obstacles and thresholds. That's what we're talking about here, actually, this conference. I mean, the interaction. And we're just struggling together, I think.
Okay. Professor. No, please.
Okay, sure. Just what you said, Zhang Ji, about Ding Guangxun and his time, and perhaps also the members of the panel. When you cite state politicians who are representatives of the Communist Party, the way that they digest ideological terms that exist within Marxism and the communist rhetoric in general, that also changed. That changed drastically from decade to decade. So when Ding Guangxun was active, he was actually interacting with a type of socialism which was very much alive. This was not, this was universal, this was global, and this was a competitor with any kind of global religion. So this was fire against fire, if you like. So in this situation, Christianity had to react differently than it has to do now. Because now, I'm not saying that socialism is dead, but it has definitely gone through a transformation process which is tremendous. It's something completely different, just 2 generations ago. So we have to compare like with like. We can't move from the 2000 where are we now? 18 to back to the 1950s, because these were very, very different intellectual worlds. So yes, so this was just a remark which I had when you spoke, and we should speak later as well. Yes, yes. That was all. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, the last question. Yeah.
Well, actually, it's not a real question. It's just an intervention, just to add maybe more food for thoughts. No, and yeah, I'm talking again from the point of view of a cultural anthropologist. So, I mean, what I mean is that we are always stressing this kind of idea of adaptation and the changing and everything. But I think that a scholar, I mean, things that, I mean, change is necessary because everything is changing. I mean, as a scholar, I'm much more interested in the things that actually are not changing. So when there are things that you think that are so important that you cannot change that, you cannot challenge them. This is, for me, from I'm an anthropologist, I have to say it again, point of view is much more interesting. And also for this kind of reciprocity, this idea of reciprocity or adaptation. I mean, it is true that there is a strong effort, maybe of the government, to fix and to set up clear rules, no, about. But there is also, again, another anthropologist, maybe Marcel Desserteau, Michel Desserteau, the French guy here. Thank you. And he's a Jesuit as well, no? Yeah. And I mean, his idea is very simple. I mean, there is the rule made by the people who are in charge because they have to make these rules, to create rules in order to organize society. But the everyday tactics of people, I mean, are chosen by the people. I mean, the city, the way roads are made, is fixed. But I have the freedom to choose how I can get to that point, to the other point in the other place, in the other side of the city. I'm choosing the streets. I'm choosing the road. So, I mean, because of this, I think that when we are talking about these big concepts like reciprocity, adaptation, authenticity, tradition, which are already a cultural construction, actually, because there is nothing authentic. There is nothing you can call tradition, but what is tradition? And so, I mean, just it's not a real question, just to think maybe in another way, in a way somehow maybe more linked to the reality of people that are sharing this faith and are living in this context. Also, this idea of Sinicization of the Christianity. Well, this is, of course. I mean, if Chinese people are living the faith, this is already this is already a Chinese Christian church. I mean, I don't see the problem, and I don't see. I mean, it's just a process of adaptation.
Okay, before we have our coffee break, Professor Shi has a few words to respond.
Just quickly, as Professor mentioned there, I think you see for my last comment is that you see if we look at the history, Christian mission history in China, and theologically and sociologically, I think you see, if you observe, you see over 1,000 years, this kind of a mission, it's a kind of a mission without and within, okay? And also, it's a mission to transform and to be transformed. And if we say Jesus is the way, and then mission is, of course, the process and the progress. I think if we look at this kind of way and to understand the contemporary Chinese situation for Christianity, and then that might provide us a kind of a way to approach it. Thank you.
So thank you for the two panelists for their inspiring presentation. Now, thank you very much. Yes.